Hello, my name is Joe Sweeney. I'm an advisor here with IVRS, and I'm also one of the authors of this mobility document that you're about to download. Now, I wanted to take a few minutes of your time just to tell you how that document came about and how you can use that document, why it's so important. We've been working with our clients over a decade, and we've noticed a substantial change over that period of time, and I'm sure you have too, in that mobility, but the very nature of what mobility is, has changed for enterprises. 6-7 years ago, mobility was very much around very discrete, very important field automation, very specific applications. But with the explosion of consumer devices, and more importantly, and I think this is sometimes a little bit invisible to some people, the explosion of good enough 3G connections at very low prices, we've seen an absolute new wave of innovation happening. What's interesting is that innovation is not always visible to the IT departments of your organization. We see this in the form of what we call shadow IT, people doing things with their own devices that IT might not be aware of, or in fact that IT might frown upon. A classic example of that is the massive use of Dropbox. So, if we were talking about creating a mobility strategy, say 7 years ago, it would be about a very discrete set of problems. But when we're talking about it now, we've got a completely different environment to work from, and therefore very different problems. Therefore, we needed a very different methodology. So we worked with a number of our clients, both on large-scale consulting projects where we're actually on the ground working with our clients, as well as many calls with clients and discussions with roundtable and so forth. We worked to create what we now call the sustainable mobility strategy. And that really consists of 3 main phases. The first phase of this is extremely important, and that's what we call the kickstart phase. We call it that because it really kicks off the initial rebirth of your mobility strategy. And it's really important to know that this type of activity, while it might seem quite onerous, doesn't actually have to take a lot of time, but it does need to get done. And it consists of 2 key parts. The first one is what we call grounded research or discovery. And it's where you go and talk to the people on the coalface of your business. If you are only talking to your managers, you're missing most of what's happening in the organization. If you get down and you ask the right questions in the right ways, and our document will show you how to do that, of the people who are actually doing business, you'll get 2 things. The first thing that you'll get is a good description of the problems that they are facing and what they want solved. In other words, the many, in most cases hundreds, of use cases that they see where mobility could help. But the other important thing that you'll find is what they're already doing, how they're working around the system. And this is vitally important because many IT organizations will say, oh, you can't be using this particular consumer, you can't be using Dropbox, we don't want you using Google Maps, or whatever it is, for a whole range of very sound reasons. But the fact is, people are going to use it. You can't really stop that. Rather than seeing it as a challenge, you need to see it as your benchmark. In other words, if it's already been done, this is a good example of what people are prepared to not only accept, but are prepared to demand from IT. And that should be the model that you're going for. So this grounded research is really, really important. And what you get out of that are literally hundreds of individual use cases. Now, in the past, IT would have taken 1 or 2 of those use cases, built out a business case for it, and then deployed. And we still see a lot of organizations working in that manner. It's a flawed approach for mobility. It's a highly flawed approach. And if you do that, what you're going to end up with is 1, spending a lot of money, wasting a lot of time, but more importantly, you're going to end up with a plethora of very disconnected solutions that just simply will not meet the business needs. Over time, you're going to get a tattered mess. So you need another phase in the kickstart, you need another stage in the kickstart phase, and that is what we call generalization. So you take all of these disparate use cases, you bring them together, and you categorize them, and you'll actually discover that in most organizations, there's only really 3, maybe 4 generalized use cases. And again, the paper will describe what that looks like and what a generalized use case actually is. But at the heart of it, it allows you to consolidate all of your problems into a couple of bigger problems, but at least you can solve them. You can solve a lot of issues by solving each one of those in turn. Now, once you've done that kickstart phase, you then come into a rolling activity, which is really what we call the structural phase, and this continues. We are not believers that your mobility strategy ever actually ends. So the structural phase is an ongoing process. The challenges that we see a lot of organisations will rush through from understanding their, if you will, their architectures that stem out of the generalisation, and they'll go straight into strategy. And that is another recipe for disaster. The challenge here is that you need a governance process so that your strategy can be framed in the light of actual needs and decision-making processes within the organisation. Now, you might say to yourself, oh, that's fine, we've got governance, we have a governance framework. Guarantee you don't have a governance framework that's going to work well with mobility. What we're finding is that mobility projects tend to be significantly smaller than your traditional big governance frameworks for waterfall approaches, but larger than maybe those little skunk works or agile projects that you've got. They sit somewhere in the middle. And more importantly, because you're dealing with innovation, because you're dealing sometimes with this concept of shadow IT that the IT department might not like, you have a situation where you need a governance framework that's very business oriented. It's agile and fast enough to make decisions, but it's not, and not bogged down, but it's not so lightweight as to end you up in a mess later on. So governance must come before the strategy part. And of course, once you've got your governance, then you can move on with your strategy, which will be a rolling activity. And your strategy literally then becomes one of identifying what are the critical problems, as specified through the generalised use cases, and then deploying upon those. And finally, you get to implementation, again, which is an ongoing activity. And implementation becomes much, much easier once you've done all that groundwork. In fact, generally what we find is that organisations who use this methodology will discover very quickly that one or two, often very inexpensive vendor products will solve significant numbers of their use cases. A good case in point is electronic forms. We find many organisations that are doing manual entry in the field, and yet a generalised forms product that can be prototyped and deployed within months, in some cases within weeks, can actually solve a vast amount of this organisation's structural problems. Now, the deeper interconnection and how that's going to fit within the architecture has also been taken into account because you've done not just generalization and governance, but you've actually gone through and thought about how this will all fit together with the rest of the systems. Hence the concept of a sustainable mobile strategy. So, we've tended to find that this strategy is a very, very appropriate, pragmatic, and relatively quick process to deploy and get up and running. It's all described in this document, so do download it, do read it. And more importantly, as you have questions as you're reading through this, and you will have questions, give us a call. Come and talk to us. I'm more than happy to share my knowledge about what I've actually seen in real organisations, both in the public and the private sector, and how that can apply in your situation. I'm Joe Sweeney, IBRS. Thank you very much and have a good day.